Thank you for your participation. Okay. Welcome for this, our opening webinar of the Unit 2. Please remember, if you need any technical assistance, you can contact using Skype at the user mesadeayuda.virtual. Please, Alejandro will. Okay, I start this session. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me properly? Because the audio I'm listening is not so good. Can you hear me? Is it working? Okay, perfect. Great. So, first of all, good morning, everyone. Again, we are really excited to be here. We did a wonderful session last week, kicking off this training. So let me just give you a little bit of a 5 minutes introduction, short introduction. First of all, as you know, this is the second training we are doing. Some of you did participate in the first training in POVRISK, which was about poverty transition. Now we are in the training of RIA plus combo. We had our first session, our first module last week, and now we are in the second module. This is about RIA, Rapid Integrated Assessment. Last week, we were lucky enough to have with us George and Kenroy for the Caribbean part. Always Maria Jose, who's doing an amazing job here. And this week, we are very honored to have Renata Rubian with us. Some of you may be familiar with UNDP structure, some others might not. Within UNDP, we have different bureaus, and Renata makes part of the Bureau for Public Policy, BPPS. So Renata leads a team who have been working on RIAs, Rapid Integrated Assessments, in several countries in our region and in other regions, and who have also been responsible for MAPS missions in several countries. I will stop for a moment to share with all of us what MAPS stands for. I believe at this point most of you are familiar with it, but just in case, MAPS, Mainstream, Acceleration, and Policy Support. We do know that the MDGs, the previous agenda, were very important, yet it took us between 5 and 7 years to kick off the MDGs in several countries. Among the differences between MDGs and SDGs, the 2030 agenda, one of the key characteristics of this new agenda is that it has been led by the governments themselves and by civil society. So the definition of the 17 goals, this is not a technocratic analysis of what the goals should be. This has been a political decision, and it shows the political will behind it. So I think that's one of the key reasons why, at least in our region, the 2030 agenda has started with so much strength, and the mainstream process has really begun very strongly. But again, MAPS, Mainstream, Acceleration, Policy Support. Acceleration, you know, it's not by chance that this training is RIA plus combos. The tool that we have for acceleration in the region is the combos. There will be other tools, and it can be complemented by other tools, but combo really, we believe, it explains what we are talking about when we talk about acceleration, right? We cannot think of 17 SDGs, 169 targets, 232 and growing indicators. We cannot think of an approach of gap by gap in the 169 targets. We cannot think that the government will have 169 secretaries of state. So how do we put national priorities at the core of the analysis and understand how the integrity, the relation between targets happens, considering that national or those national priorities in the center of the analysis? So policy support, of course, the kind of policies that we can develop, that we can help develop, that we can propose, that will help advance the agenda. So today is not about understanding all the differences between the MDGs and the SDGs, but it is key to understand that this new agenda requires new ways of working, and the Rapid Integrated Assessment is a very relevant tool to actually initiate this discussion. The RIA, the Rapid Integrated Assessment, can be seen as an enabler for MAPS mission. It can be seen as an enabler for advancing a combo approach, it can be seen, and it should be seen, as an enabler to initiate or to deepen the discussion about the SDGs in a given country or a territory. We can do a RIA for a country. We can also support local authorities do a RIA for their own territories. So think of the RIA, and we will see this as the presentation by Renata progresses, but we should think of the RIA as an enabler, as a kickstarter of certain discussions, and that's very important to bear in mind. The RIA is technical and it's political. You will see that there is a technical analysis to be held, and there is a political discussion to follow from this technical analysis. So again, I'm really thrilled that we have Renata with us today. You will see the presentation. It's brilliant, it's very practical, and it draws from experiences that have been held in different countries and in different regions. She will be focusing on Sri Lanka as an example, and then she will draw in other cases. And I would like to take advantage of this moment to also acknowledge Gonzalo Pizarro's role. He's based in Panama. He's in leave these days, so we couldn't have him join us the discussion today. But of course, he has helped us develop the materials, and he will help us go ahead with other RIAs as he had done as he has done in the past. And of course, I would like to acknowledge and congratulate and thank the team behind this work for doing an excellent job. So with further ado, I pass the floor to Renata. We have now about 1 hour and 20 minutes. We can either leave the questions for the end, or we can answer the questions as they come. So if you have specific questions that they are burning, you will see that some of these questions will be answered in a later slide, but please feel free to make the questions. I will be taking them, and we will answer them if necessary on the go. And if it's more pertinent to leave some of them to the end, we might as well do so. Thank you so much for your active participation. Renata, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you so much, Alejandro and colleagues, for having me here. Pleased to be part and support this webinar in ARBILAC. Please, if at any moment, if I'm speaking, it's not clear, kindly send a note, and I'll try to slow down or try to clarify whatever is the issue being is spoken on. So, like Alejandro said, this presentation today is going to focus on one specific methodology. But before introducing the methodology of the RIA of Rapid Integrated Assessment, just want to recall a few elements of the 2030 Agenda. The first thing is the principles of the 2030 Agenda. So we know this is an agenda that promotes universality, is an agenda that's applicable to all, to developed and developing countries. We also know this is an agenda that promotes an integrated approach, meaning that we need to understand the relationship across the goals, across the targets, in terms of identifying the synergies and the trade-offs of selecting one target over another, and being able to balance these different dimensions in order to achieve sustainable development. And the third principle that I would like to highlight, which for all countries, not just Latin American countries, is very relevant, is the principle that no one left behind. And here is really the idea to not just the technical work, but political advocacy to ensure that countries see the need for using disaggregated data to understand what reaching the last mile means, and then going beyond average to ensure that this is an agenda that brings results to all, not just to one segment of the population. Alejandro explained very well before the maps. The maps is an approach, it's not a methodology. It's an approach that has been agreed with the agencies within the UN development system. MAPS stands for mainstreaming acceleration policy support. Like Alejandro explained well, the mainstreaming, I just want to flag that at the country level, with the UN country team, we do want to ensure that UNDAF, the UN framework for development assistance, is well aligned as well with the SDG work and support the agencies lent to the governments. On acceleration, Alessandro put it well. This is not an agenda that can be achieved goal by goal, target by target. So our idea is really working with countries, applying different methodologies. One of them is really understanding what are the barriers, the bottlenecks to accelerate or to achieve progress. And then by applying an integrated approach of understanding the connections across the different areas, being able to identify areas that can be catalytic and promote progress across multiple goals. In terms of policy support, I just want to say that the UN is basically offering a package of support that entails policy support, tools, methodologies, country cases, best practices, and here is really based on the experience of different agencies on their portfolio of work. I know that in coming months the UNDG will launch a platform which has some of these tools that's being offered by different countries, and then that also includes the tools that's being offered by UNDP. So moving forward, before we start, I want to flag that we all know this is an agenda that requires a national compact. It's an agenda that requires multi-stakeholder engagement. If we look briefly at the 169 targets, we see that 135 targets will require the engagement of national governments directly. 110 targets at a minimum will require actions by local governments. 54 targets have a nature that's very much international, so that depends on the international cooperation. And 88 targets will require the active engagement of the private sector. And of course, we will need the engagement of civil society across the agenda for the actual delivery of results. I also want to share with you, this is a dashboard for the status of the countries in Latin America and Caribbean. This was calculated by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, so the source is there. So they are using data from the World Bank and they're using data from the UN Statistics Department. Here is basically the colors is a traffic light system, so meaning that the red is really, which is really off track, that requires a lot of efforts. The yellow are the areas where some efforts and some results are being achieved, but it still requires a little bit more. And the green areas is really the areas where it has been achieved, but it requires the governments, the countries to maintain their efforts so that they are not, they don't reverse the gains made. I find it interesting because it's not surprising that if you look at SDG 10, you see that for all countries it is red in Latin America and Caribbean. So it is an enormous challenge for the countries here to make a significant stride against the targets in this goal. But you also see that the goal 16 on governance, because it entails civic participation, it includes violence. It is also a goal that for several countries in our region is indeed a challenge because of urban violence and other issues. And for me, actually, was a surprise when I saw the goal 3, which is, you see there, that all the countries are actually having a challenge on this goal. So I haven't looked in depth in the calculations, but I just wanted to show this just to make the point that this is a very challenging agenda, and it's a challenging agenda not just for a few, but for all the countries. So certainly countries will need the support and the partnerships that they can, tap on to be able to make progress. Moving forward, the UNDP package of support includes 6 elements. So you see there on your screen, these elements of package of support, they are not offered in a linear manner. They can happen concomitantly. So for instance, the first one is about the alignment. So it's really assessing the readiness of a country to implement the SDGs. So it's really looking at mainstreaming approaches. Here today we are going to talk about the rapid integrated assessment. Then number 2, we are talking about planning, actions. Here will be prioritizing, identifying accelerators for SDG progress. 3 is the localization process, making this global agenda relevant for local agendas. 4 is integrating into the budgetary frameworks. 5, issues related to data, monitoring, production of reports at national and subnational level. And the last one will be obviously advocacy, political advocacy, capitalization of resources, identification of partnerships, and that's an element that needs certainly to happen throughout all the stages of the implementation. Moving very forward specifically to the RIA. RIA is a methodology, is an approach, the Rapid Integrated Assessment. It is not rapid. The name is very misleading. It's very, it can be work intense, but it is a very simple, intuitive methodology, and I think that's the reason why we wanted to say rapid. And it basically can be applied to any planning document, national development plan, sectoral plans. In some countries, we have actually applied to national development plans that were being developed. They had not been adopted, to see the results and to engage the political parties and the political partners in a political discourse, in a technical discourse, in discussion. We have also applied at subnational level, and in the subnational level we have applied at government programs. They were not local agendas, like in India, in Haryana, we did an assessment of 54 provincial programs. So what does this methodology delivers? So you see here in the slide, it is basically a quick way to see the alignment of the plan, of the program, of the document you are analyzing, to see the alignment with the SDGs, and obviously it can be at national, subnational level. It does permit you to see which targets in the SDGs are prioritized by multiple sectors or multiple areas or multiple plans. It does permit you to quickly identify potential gaps. And here for us, the gaps are very important because you will need to probe further on the character of each of those gaps to really certify if those gaps will be SDG targets that are not aligned, that have not been integrated into those plans, to indeed certify if those SDG targets that are not prioritized or integrated, they are relevant for your country context or not. And it does allow you, at the last point, is as you do the assessment, to verify which are the institutions engaged in the implementation and monitoring, and if there is a potential for cross-institutional collaboration. So just in summary, so we have 4 steps that we are going to go through today very quickly, but the first step is the actual analysis of the alignment. I will work with you on the template that we have to see how the mapping is done and the identification of gaps is done. The step 2 is basically assessment of the integrated approach of the targets that are being prioritized. Are the different dimensions really balanced? The third is the element of the institutional framework. So what is the architecture? So in some plans, they are very explicit to identify which are the entities, government entities, ministries, departments that are in charge of implementation of monitoring. Some plans not so clear. And the fourth one is just to highlight some of the work and some of the indicators, so you will be able to see a visualization of what the RIA delivers in terms of indicators that are present in the plans or not. So moving to step 1, the actual alignment assessment. This is the template that we use. So basically the template 1, which it can be a very vanilla, simple, template, needs to be, the first thing you need to do is to adapt this template to the country that you will be assessing, or into the plan that you will be assessing. So if you look at the left column, it's basically These are the policy area sectors contained in the National Development Plan, in the investment plan of Sri Lanka, which is the case that we are assessing here today. I've selected Sri Lanka because it's a very interesting country. It's a mid-income country, has interesting challenges comparable to some of the countries in Latin America, and obviously is a country that has transitioned to peace very recently, coming out of 25 years of war. But it's a mid-income country with the aspiration to become high-income country in the next 10 years. So you see on the left side the areas of the plan for Sri Lanka. In the right side, what you see, those columns are basically, each column is a column for a target within the SDG agenda. So you see goal by goal, target by target. And after you have adapted the template to the plan that you are assessing for the country that you are assessing, the second thing that you need to do is to read the 169 targets and do a rapid assessment. In this case, it really needs to be rapid, but to really indicate which targets you feel would be not applicable to that particular country. So here in this template, the orange ones, I'm marking the targets that we judged not relevant for Sri Lanka. If you read the framework of the 169 targets, we will see that a lot of targets relate to least developed countries. So there is a lot of reference to target specifics throughout the Cs and SEEDs, the small island development states. And there are some targets that also relate to developed countries. So basically, we structured the ones that are not relevant. For landlocked countries, obviously, you will eliminate the targets, most of the targets under SDG 14 on oceans. So I basically, I hope you get the idea of what it is, this orange columns, which is basically the targets that are not relevant in this country context. I do not advise to delete them, because what happens is that some of the targets, sometimes you think it's not relevant in that context. And then as you do the analysis of a national development plan or sector plan, you realize that perhaps that target has some relevance for that country. The columns that have been marked in pink and that you see in your screen, these are the columns for the targets that are considered that are gaps. And here I don't want us to be fixated on the idea that these are targets, SDG targets, that are not a priority or they have not been prioritized by Sri Lanka, because we don't know yet the situation. But the idea is to indicate that based on the rapid integrated assessment methodology, these targets, which are the columns in pink, they have a priori now, preliminary, being identified as not being integrated, and that could potentially be not prioritized in the planning process. Okay? So these are possibilities which we'll need to probe further. If you can see, there are some little squares. Okay, orange is yellowish. Okay. Yeah. So if you would see that there is a little squares, and then in the squares you see that there are some green colors, and there is an F. This means targets, the green squares. This means targets that have been assessed fully aligned. And I want you to think about now, let's think together here of the difference between the yellow and the green. There are some little yellow, oops, let me go back, sorry. There are some little yellow squares, you can see here. The yellow squares, these are targets that have been partially integrated or aligned into the specific section or sector of the plan, okay? The green is fully aligned. So what you would have to do is develop a criteria based on your country context, and particularly based on the plan, what the plan or what the document you are assessing offers you, because the national development plans and sector plans, they differ. Some planning instruments, they are very specific, they are very concrete. So, for instance, if the government is talking about poverty reduction, in some plans you would say reduce poverty by X%, benefit groups A, B, C, target areas X, Y, Z. So some plans are very, very specific. Some other plans are very generic. So I'm saying this because you need to prepare criteria to define fully aligned and partially aligned, a criteria that's realistic to make a technical assessment and, if possible, a quantitative assessment of how aligned these targets are based on that planning instrument, that document that you are looking at. Okay? For Sri Lanka, here in this specific case, fully aligned means the little green squares. Fully aligned means targets where, when you look into the plan, the government is providing specific targets in terms of what's going to be achieved in the next 2-3 years. And in some cases, the government is providing clear indicators of how this is actually going to be measured. And because in the specific case of Sri Lanka, which is not the case of all the countries, we were looking at the investment plan. Then we also looked at the allocation of resources. So fully aligned here means you either have specific targets in the plan that related to that SDG target, specific indicators referred, and in a lot of cases a budget connected to it. The yellow in counterpart, the yellow squares, the criteria for the yellow squares means that that topic of that SDG target is recognized in the body of the development plan. It can be at the level of the narrative in the introduction, but that you don't see any specific target that you could measure or any indicator that could allow you to monitor the achievement of that SDG target. Why is it important to say partially aligned? Because you actually, you're going to engage with the political partners into a debate. And it's important to see what is in the radar of the government and what is not in the radar of the government. Some development issues that may be of relevance to a particular country might not be even integrated into the narrative, might not even be part of the official discourse of the government, for whatever reason it is, because of lack of capacity, lack of resources, or for political sensitive issues, or maybe because of the orientation of the government that's not considering a priority there. So that's why this distinction between partially aligned, fully aligned, and potential gaps. Please, I'm saying potential gaps because you will only know if these are indeed gaps when you actually engage in a discussion in a quality assurance process with the government. But with the rapid assessment...
Potential gaps being pink.
Pink. These potential gaps are the SDG targets marked in pink, because in the analysis with the methodology, you were unable to identify these targets either in the narrative or informing the discourse of the plan or the program, or you were not able to identify specific targets, indicators, or in some very specific cases, a budget associated with it. So you will get this table for all the 169 targets. And what we do is that you can do this. I usually like to do this in Word. It's just a technicality, but it's because I like to put footnotes so I can go back and I can refer, so that during the quality assurance process, when you're talking with the government or the partners to do a peer review of this, you can actually go back and have a consensus of the gap areas or the areas that have been integrated. But then we transplant these results from this table into an Excel sheet that will help you to do an automatic calculation of a visualization, which I'm going to show you later. But this is the overall mapping results. I mentioned to you initially that one of the things you do is assess which targets are not relevant for your country context. In the case of Sri Lanka, we look at the 169 targets. We eliminated, 16 targets. So we were looking only at 153 targets, which includes also the means of implementations, the 1A, 1B, and then SDG 17. So we are working with a universe of 153 targets to do this analysis. Out of the 153 targets, when we did the analysis target by target under each goal, we see that we got 109 targets that have been aligned. Among the targets that have been aligned, as you recall, I was saying some of them are fully aligned and some of them are partially aligned. So we have fully aligned, it was 64. I don't know if you can read this, but it looks very fuzzy. But fully aligned was considered 64, and partially aligned is the 45. Based on the criteria that I said you would have to adapt based on your country context, particularly based on your instrument that you're analyzing, if it's a program or a national development plan or sector plan, subnational plan. So moving to step 2, which is trying to understand the integrated nature of the targets that have been integrated, what we do is that in our Excel sheet that I showed you before, we already include in the back of the Excel sheet is already automatic. We already classify every single target, it's classified what is the dimension of the sustainable development. Please note that some targets may be classified as relevant for social and prosperity. Some targets may be only planet, some targets may be planet and prosperity. So you obviously have some targets that have relevance across multiple dimensions of sustainable development. But the idea here is to have an understanding across the 169 targets, which I mentioned before. How do they provide a picture for the country in terms of the integrated nature of these 5 dimensions, to provide a profile of the country. So when I calculate the profile of the country for Sri Lanka based on my template 1 of the 109 targets that have been aligned, this is what, yes, we will share the presentation as well. I'm not sure if you have the presentation, but some people are asking for the presentation. So you will get a profile for the country, and here you see the profile, going back, the profile on the 5 dimensions relevant for sustainable development: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And here the important is to understand that the objective is not to have a full alignment of 100% coverage here, but the objective is to have a balance across the dimensions that are being prioritized, the targets of the SDGs that are integrated or that are included in the plan and that hopefully will be implemented. So in the case of Sri Lanka, which is not unique, you do see a propensity of countries to prioritize and to integrate most of the SDG targets that are related to economic growth, prosperity. In the case of Sri Lanka, even though it's a country that's doing the transition to peace, we see that the National Development Plan of Investment is not perhaps prioritizing sufficient some governance dimensions that could have relevance to be able to capitalize on the peace dividends and to promote, sustainable peace in the country. We also notice that partnership in many cases is not clearly defined. What we are saying here is not that it's not happening. What we are saying here is what is the analysis of the plan is providing us. So that's what we are able to speculate at this stage, to be able to have questions, to have that dialogue with the government counterparts and with partners. So when you look at the here, you see here in the corner, the calculation, basically you see that prosperity, 95% of the SDG targets related to economic growth have been integrated. 80% of the targets related to social dimensions to people have been integrated. 58% of the SDG targets related to environment have been integrated, and 42% related to governance issues and peace have been integrated, versus 38% of partnerships. So, like I said, the objective is not to have 100%, but to have a balance across all those dimensions, because a decision to invest in people, to reduce poverty, will have an impact that could be negative on the planet or on the environment, could be negative, could be as well positive, and could have a very positive impact on economic growth. But it's important to see how this is balanced. So if we go back, remember that I said that out of the 153 SDG targets that we worked on the template 1, when we do the calculation, this is another visualization that in Excel you are able to produce. And I find this useful because we're really looking, probing deeper at the level of the target, but it's useful to have a kind of a global picture of what would be the profile in terms of the alignment of the SDGs in the country. So here, what you see is a representation of the alignment of the 109 targets, which includes the targets that have been considered partially aligned, and the targets that have been considered based on the criteria that was established from the beginning, fully aligned. So you get a picture, this maple leaf, which shows, which shows the totality of the targets that have been aligned, 109 for the case of Sri Lanka. And here you can see very clearly that all the targets for poverty have been integrated. So you see there it's 100%. All the targets for water and sanitation under SDG 6 have been integrated. All the targets on SDG 10 are integrated into the plan. All the targets for climate are integrated. Education. And then you see the targets that have not been so integrated. SDG 17 on partnerships, means of implementation. You see it's here. You see peace is a little bit here, governance. You see the environmental related goals. They are, some of them have been integrated. And you see here, I always like to mention the SDG 14 because Sri Lanka is, as we know, is an island. So you would assume that marine resources, and also not just to be an island, but any country that is not landlocked, but that has marine resources, should be able to prioritize also targets on SDG 14. Here's another representation that's also generated from the Excel sheet calculation, from that first template that I showed you. And here is not the totality. Here is a representation only of the targets that are fully aligned. So this is fully aligned. So these are the targets that I mentioned before, that based on the criteria, are targets that have specific targets in the plan or in the document, so you know in the X years what is to be achieved. In some cases, specific indicators, so you know how to monitor those, in some cases specific indicators. And in the case of Sri Lanka, which is not really the case for all countries because it's an investment plan, we also had resources associated with some of those targets. So you see, when we superimpose, what I wanted to show actually before showing the next graph, you will see here then basically the entire area of SDG targets related to environment have been you see here, have been recessed here in the graph. What does this mean is that the targets that have been aligned here, they actually do not have specific targets in the plan or in document or indicators or resources associated with it. That's why you see this difference here. On the other hand, when we superimpose, you see here, SDG 6 on water and sanitation, we said that in the totality was fully aligned. This is the calculation. The orange is the total, right? That's partially aligned and fully aligned. And the blue is the fully aligned, meaning, like I said, based on our criteria. So you see the difference. What is the difference? Is that there is a strong recognition of the vulnerability of Sri Lanka, let's say on SDG 13, on climate-related issues. But perhaps this plan that we look at have not been very specific in aligning the SDG targets on climate to this plan. The same thing on oceans. Remember that we said it's an island state with a lot of marine resources. You see here where the narrative is. The narrative is about 30 to 40%. That's of integration. But when you look at the full alignment, there is no single target on the SDG 14 that's fully aligned. So meaning that the narrative is strong for the orange, but these areas where you see the regressing here entering means that the narrative is strong, but the instruments to implement that is noted in the plan are not too specific. Look at SDG 5. There is a strong recognition also in the government discourse that gender equality is very important for Sri Lanka, but then the specific targets that being fully aligned, they are here. You remember that in template 1 I mentioned about the columns in pink. Those were the gaps. And the gaps we have to be very careful, but the gaps allow you to have an interesting debate with the government and with the partners, because you will need to probe further the nature of the gaps. Here you will need to see if the gaps are related to SDG targets that are cross-cutting and that will have an impact on other multiple targets. So what is the nature of that target? You will also see if it's a target that requires investment immediately in order to yield results in medium or long term. For instance, climate change targets, usually the results you would see not in less than 5 years. So climate change adaptation, we know it's a long-term process, it's a medium to long-term process. So therefore, investments in climate change adaptation will require some investment immediately to be able to yield results in 5 to 10 to 15 years. We also ask to, like I showed you, to look at the nature of the target, if it's a target that's more based on environmental, environmental issues, or if it's social, is a target with a social nature, or if it's a target that's very much focused on economic growth, or if it's partnership, or if it's governance. Looking not just, here I put 3 SG dimensions, but it's really the 5 Ps. So you're really looking at the 5 P dimensions to be able to see if the targets that are not being prioritized, what is their characteristics. Why I'm saying this? Because we are mapping here at the target level. So if we look at the SDG 1, we have one target that is very much related to climate change. So that target obviously will have an impact on social, but will very much have an impact on environment. So if that target under SDG 1 on poverty is not prioritized, means that you are then reducing a little bit of your effort on the environmental dimension. If we look at SDG 15 on biodiversity or SDG 14 on oceans, what we also see is that some of the targets, they have a element that's more related to prosperity, to economic growth. And their nature related to conservation is much more reduced. So if a country is prioritizing a plan, targets that have that don't have a conservation element or characteristic to it, but prioritizing only targets related to one of the dimensions of sustainable development, that could be a problem. That relates to the balance that we wanted to say. And the last element I wanted to say here, when you probe the question, is really that it allows you to think in terms of, for the targets that are cross-cutting, there will be targets. If you go back to the first slide when I showed the template, there were SDG targets that are prioritized by multiple sectors or multiple areas in the National Development Plan, in the investment plan of Sri Lanka. And there is really to ask the question, are these sectors, are the sectors responsible for those development areas really collaborating, engaging in a conversation for planning and investment, or they are just going solo, doing their plan and not having that conversation? So here it allows you to think of areas that needs that conversation, that new modality of work. Very, very quickly, what I wanted to say is that when we look, when we look at the nature of the targets, you start asking those questions and you start teasing out dimensions of development areas related to those SDG targets that are not integrated, that could be of relevance for that particular country to be able to achieve the vision that the country wants. In the case of Sri Lanka, they want to become a high-income country, high-income, middle-income country in 10 years' time. So here when we look at some of the potential areas of gaps, SDG targets that have not been integrated, these are some of the areas that have not been integrated. And one area that's worth to look at is sexual and reproductive health rights, targets, because there it's limited. It's not a universal coverage. So you have an entire segment of the population, the young population, adolescents or teenagers, that will not necessarily have access to sexual and reproductive health care. The plan does not integrate that sufficiently. The plan also does not integrate sufficiently, the idea of unpaid domestic care work. It's an area that we have understood to be an area of a struggle for many countries. Out of the 33 countries that we have applied the RIA methodology, this target, which is SDG target 5.4, is a recurrent target that most countries have a difficulty to integrate. And here the question is not to say, oh, this is not relevant. That's not the objective. It's to probe why this has not been integrated. It could be because resources are not available. It could be because data is not available, capacity is not available. Government is unable to measure this effectively. The government is unable to come up with instruments that effectively bring the results of unpaid domestic care work to address those dimensions, to create a system of social protection that can indeed protect those, or particular women in most cases, that are providing unpaid domestic and care, work and services. So what I'm basically saying is that all those areas allows you to ask a lot of questions and be able to do a further investigation and look at the data if data is available, and talk to the experts from different sectors, talk to partners, talk to government officials, to be able to better understand what is the situation in the country. Here I wanted to focus on the situation of women, gender equality in Sri Lanka, because in order to achieve full sustainable development in the country, they won't be able to do that if they don't make the right investment of women. There will be engagement of women for access of resources, land, credit, jobs, education, technical training, as you can imagine. So here, if we look only at the SDG 5, and here I'm using the traffic light system, so this colors is not the colors of the goal, but basically is that you see there that was fully aligned was the target 5.5 and 5.C when we did the assessment. The orange, yellowish, the targets that are partially aligned within SDG 5 on gender equality. And the red targets, you would see 4 targets that are not aligned at all in the plan. But what I want to show is that this is the point of departure. So I'm making an assessment looking at gender, the situation of women. But if we don't go beyond goal 5 to really understand what are the other SDG targets in other goals that will have a direct relevance to move the situation, to promote women empowerment, women economic empowerment, women rights, women access to justice. If you don't look at other SDG targets which have a direct relevance to gender equality, you will not be able to provide that integrated vision of what it should be, areas of potential areas of investment that the government should look at. So here I'm looking at promoting gender equality, and I'm including all the other targets that would be of relevance for the government of Sri Lanka to look on how they are investing. So here you would see that 3.1 is maternal mortality, so it's being fully aligned. 4.5, which is on gender disparities on education, is fully aligned, is an area also prioritized by the government explicitly. And you see 1.4 is on the access of economic resources. In Sri Lanka is really far behind. It's partially aligned, access to credit. And also 8.5, it's decent job, participation of women in the market actually in the past 20 years. If you run the data for employment and data available for this indicator, for this target on 8.5, you'll see that Sri Lanka has basically stagnated. So you still have 50% of the women that could still enter the workforce that has not entered the workforce. So that's a missed opportunity for Sri Lanka. And then you can basically go on and on and on and assess. The 3.7 is the sexual reproductive health rights, which I had spoken before. It's actually a SDG target that appears twice, appears on the gender goal and appears on the health goal. So that one has not been prioritized. So you basically get a composite, an idea, integrated vision of different areas. You see how the RIA has shown the alignment or not in terms of the plan, and then it allows you to have informed discussion with the government that if the government is serious to achieve sustainable development, they need to do that so with the active participation of women and look at the different dimensions of that active participation to promote gender equality means. So moving forward, that's the same thing of the different goals that we need to look.
So Renata, before you go there, let me make a small pause here, because I think the messages that Renata was conveying are absolutely key, right? So I would like that we all make sure that we understand what this is about. And we have seen some countries that they were rather looking at the SDGs at the goal level rather than at the target level. So here we see what happens when we deepen a little bit, right? It's not just SDG 5 gender or SDG 1 poverty, and then we have our own imagination of what it is. There are targets below which are much more concrete and which allow us to also see the link with other targets, right? So here we are saying that when we start to deepen our analysis in one of the dimensions, in this case gender, and seeing at what the government is planning, we start to see how this is linked to many other dimensions, including social protection, including labor opportunities, including how we develop our citizens and our cities. And this is something that's familiar for us in Latin America, the Caribbean, right? So when we start thinking about, let's say, the challenges we have regarding citizen security, the way cities are planned, the way public lighting is established has a direct impact on how security is not only perceived but is lived, and it has a direct impact on how women are included or not included. When we think about systems of care, and we did document that very thoroughly in the Human Development Report, systems of care are directly linked to the possibilities that women have or don't have to duly incorporate to the labor market, and actually to have more formal labor markets than informal, where they can only go to the market when there are other obligations that are not paid for, allow them to. So again, if we start to deepen a little bit this kind of thought, we start to get closer and we start to understand why we are doing the RIA together with the combos, right? In my initial remarks, I did say that RIAs can be linked or not linked to a further maps analysis. And we have done RIA, and then we have sometimes not done the maps analysis. But certainly every time we've done a maps analysis, we have done a RIA beforehand. And we can see here how a RIA could also very well inform a combo analysis that will come later, right? So at the end of the day, let's bear this in mind. The RIA is a very technical analysis, or can be a very technical analysis, and it is important that we ensure quality, but it is also a trigger for political discussions. So what we have to see here is how this becomes an enabler of certain discussions that sometimes are stuck in a given sector or to a very close group of population. How can this open to other groups? And I think now Renata is going to give us a very important example in the case of Sri Lanka, on how some things that are key to the entire country sometimes are constrained to a group of population because other, or of decision makers, because other don't seize the opportunity to duly integrate this into national plans. So please, let's keep this in mind as we keep going in this presentation.
So I think that's an important element, because as we know, like planning documents and sectoral plans, they often are prepared by very good technical experts within that area. And now with an integrated agenda, you require an ability to be able to understand transversally across all the sectors or development areas the elements that are important to the area or to the sector that you're working on. And as we know, that's a challenge, because you may have a cadre of experts that is very good, it's very specialized, but this is a challenge for all countries now, to be able to have an ability to mine or to understand issues across, you know, the different areas, to be able to link to that when you are doing the planning, when we are doing the implementation. And we were having here a conversation that when I went to Sri Lanka, and I was having conversation, we were in a MAPS mission, and we were having a conversation with the government about the results of the rapid integrated assessment. One thing that really shocked us a little bit is the fact that how much the targets under SDG 14 on oceans, life underwater, are not integrated, are not so visible in the planning documents. And like I said, I don't want to use the word prioritized, because it's a dangerous thing to say. I'm not saying that Sri Lankan government did not prioritize issues related to ocean. All I'm saying is that the planning documents that we looked at, they were mute to have that indication of how the SDG targets on SDG 14 were effectively integrated, or were effectively being supposedly, hopefully at some stage, being implemented by the government. And one picture that I put for the government, and they felt that was very telling, and particularly when we're talking at the Planning Ministry and Finance, because if you go to the Department of Fisheries, for them, obviously, oceans is everything, because they only think fisheries, fisheries, fisheries. And I'm not saying that not anybody has an ability to think transversally, but when you go to the Planning and Finance, of course, their knowledge and their ability to understand issues related to ocean, and now with the blue economy issues growing so rapidly, of the country's understanding that there is a huge potential for the economy, huge potential for social development and jobs generation that comes from the blue economy, that comes from the oceans, I think this becomes more relevant. So I showed to them to say, look, in the investment plan, we don't have any investments related to SDG 14 targets or oceans per se, but yet Sri Lanka is an island with exclusive economic zone that is almost 7 times its territorial land. So the argument here is not to say, yes, then you have to put 7 times the investment on the oceans. I'm not saying that, and we are not saying that. But it's to say that if Sri Lanka is indeed going to achieve the vision that the government wants of high middle-income country in 10 years, some of these investments will have to be done on the oceans. It will be either related to marine protected areas. Right now, the government has 0.4, which is less than 1% of its coastal area is marine protected areas. The SDGs recommend 10%. of the marine protected areas. Why? Because as we know that those protected areas have a huge impact on fish stocks in the country, in the areas. They have one of the unique areas of reproduction of blue whales that come to reproduce in this area that's between India and Sri Lanka. And it's an area where we know these species are in danger and has a huge potential for ecotourism to generate jobs. So basically it's to say that, like Alejandro said before, the RIA is not expected to be an assessment or a process that is 100% accuracy. That's not the intention. The objective of a government or a country should not be also 100% of alignment. Like I said, the objective here is twofold. One is to have an intelligent, informed debate with the government that can orient the direction of the implementation of the SDGs. And the objective is to have a clear idea of these areas that could be relevant for the country, that could perhaps be more integrated and therefore at some stage prioritized and implemented. Okay, so we move forward. So it's basically to say, I want to show some institutional mechanism afterwards, after this, but when you're doing the analysis, what is relevant is to really see that if you indeed a country has the adequate policy framework in place to support the SDGs. In some cases, the policy instruments are not there. In a lot of cases, in a majority of cases, the instruments will be there. But we know also that policies are not sufficient and they can only be effective as they are with the implementation, and that's the link that Alejandro mentioned about the COMS and the idea of needing to pursue catalytic areas for acceleration. And I think we said it before as well, Alejandro said in his introduction, which is that we are working in most countries, we are working in a situation of finite resources. So the resource envelope is already defined. So there is a need to have a dialogue with government and partners to set clear criteria on how to tackle this agenda. We said it's not goal by goal, target by target, but how do you prioritize and how do you sequence development interventions at the country level? So that's what this methodology expects to support.
One last thing here, and I think it's a thought that we may have, and I would like to clarify it. We can think that maybe this integrity, this vision of how things are connected, it might even seem like a luxury, right? Like, okay, before we were trying sector by sector and we didn't achieve, and now we want to make it more complicated. We believe it's rather than a luxury, we believe it's essential. And we believe that maybe we were not having so many results before precisely because we were not connecting the dots. So if you have a Ministry of Education going in one direction with specific educational things, and on the other side, the Ministry of Agriculture is going in a different direction, and on the other side, and you have this scattered approach where rather than putting some priorities at the center and making sure that they are properly addressed, you have a piecemeal approach, then actually you are being less efficient with your resources. So let's not think about this as a luxury, as trying to invent something that's impossible. And it's going to be an institutional challenge, and Renata is going to take us now through that. But let's think of that as a unique opportunity to actually be more efficient in the use of the, as Renata was saying, resources that are finite, right? That they are not infinite. Yeah. So Renata.
So the step 3, and this is integrated into one of the templates of the RIA, is that as you analyze the planning documents, you analyze the sector plans, you see which line ministries, departments within the government basically taking a lead responsibility or co-leading responsibility for certain goals. So here is just a quick assessment of the institutions in Sri Lanka. Actually, they have 53 line ministries. I think Sri Lanka gets the world record of line ministries, number of line ministries. So this is not a complete table. So we mapped them across the goals. But then as we did the RIA, we also did the institutional mapping here per target. And you would see in some cases, obviously, you would have 2 ministries or 1 ministry in a department. And we also did for the UN country team, to help with the UN country team, we also did the mapping of the UN country team portfolio against the different targets. For Sri Lanka, because we were also looking at the indicators in terms of the data availability, across the SDG targets, we marked the ones that were targets that are related to the MDGs. So we marked all of them. These are the ones marked in green. So that's why I'm marking here, those. Because it is expected. In the case of Sri Lanka, it's a country that has a very robust and a very strong National Statistics Office. So the assumption here is that for every single area or SDG target that had an indicator which was previously used within the MDG framework, or that was used at the MDG framework that was used by the country, which not necessarily just the MDG framework globally, but the formal and the proxy indicators for MDGs, the expectation is that the data is available. So when we talk about the institutional architecture, we also did an assessment of several institutions during the MDGs, because it was clear that a strong or the right institutional architecture for our country is key to move an agenda forward. So this is something that obviously everybody would confirm, from country experiences, that the institutional arrangement, while it will differ from country to country to a specific context, in the case of the SDGs, like Alejandro was saying, because it's an integrated agenda, it's much more complex and will require this intersectoral collaboration, means that the challenge for countries to put a coordination mechanism that's effective is much bigger, is much larger. Because now what countries are doing is to basically assess what kind of incentive systems they can put in place to facilitate coordination, to facilitate joint work. In a lot of the countries that we are working in providing support, this identification of the areas where you have multiple sectors or multiple departments leading does help to have a conversation about co-financing. I don't know if the co-financing approach is going to be included in the webinar at one of the modules, but UNDP does have some instruments to discuss about co-financing, which is also very interesting, because co-financing is one of the approaches to facilitate cross-sectoral collaboration. UNDP is also elaborating a tool which is called Institution and Coordination Mechanism tool. I know Alejandro mentioned before that do you want to say that?
Yeah, I mean,
that the ABLAC you've done.
Some of you may be aware, but there is a document where we have analyzed what is the institutional arrangements that the different countries in the region have undertaken. Mm-hmm. So that document is available, and I believe it's available in the course materials as well. Should it not be, I'm asking here formally Andrea, Oscar, Ivan, Maria Jose to make sure that we put it available and that the link is there for people to look at it. But basically, we have a study which has been until the moment that we did the research, which was at some point this year, I believe we are 2017 now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we did analyze which were the countries that had taken a certain kind of institutional arrangements to advance the SDGs. Some cases, like Argentina, they were just adapting the mechanism they had at the MDG time and making it up to considering the specificities of the SDGs. In some other cases, they built it from scratch. But that information is also available, and I'm sure it's gonna be interesting for some countries that are in the process of deciding how the institutional arrangement should be. Mm-hmm. And of course, we know that this will evolve over time, and there will be adjustments. And there is first of all, it's tailor-made. Each country will have its own mechanism. But second, we are going to need to evolve as the SDGs evolve, and we realize on the needs and adaptation.
Yes. So the UNDP is coming with this institutional coordination mechanism. So it's a mapping, it's a menu of different mechanisms globally from different countries. The idea is not to provide a checklist that countries go and check, but the idea is to provide elements to assess the functions, interesting functions that would be applicable to a particular country context. Everything obviously has to be contextualized. And here in this slide are some of the elements of functions, coherence, and key ingredients which we consider that could make an institutional mechanism successful for the coordination of the SDGs. Like Alejandro said, it is indeed across the world a reality that many countries either have built on successful instruments that were coordinating the MDGs and adapting it to the new realities and challenges of the SDGs. In other cases, yes, establishing a new institution that may either be linked directly to the cabinet level of the president, or that may be linked to a specific line ministry, either a ministry on sustainable development or a ministry on environment, or sometimes Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Planning and Finance. So it really depends. Here we are not, of course, advocating for a particular structure, but it really depends on the country context to understand what's the governance structure, the areas of priority, how the government is really configured in terms of line ministries, departments, and then also at the subnational level, what's the level of decentralization to be able to decide on the features that would be relevant. But some of the things that we really say for success in terms of key ingredients is that we do advocate for institutions that obviously have a clear mandate and ideally endorsed at the highest level. We do advocate for institutions that will count with the participation of non-governmental actors, so civil society, academia, private sector, to engage them in the direction of perhaps even influencing, forming plans, but also having a helping hand for implementation. And we do see that it is recommended in many cases, and we see that's the direction that many countries are taking, to have a strong and technically capable secretariat that is able to support that if a country has decided to have a higher institution at the highest level, but a capable, technically strong secretariat is very important. I think you mentioned, Alejandro, in the beginning, it is a process that constitutes elements of technicality and political. So it's important that in the technical elements that the country is able to bring the best evidence, the best knowledge, and be able to capitalize across the multi-stakeholder levels to be able to identify the information and that would be relevant. And then, because at the highest level, of course, the political process will often drive the agenda, but it's informed by a technical process. So just very quickly, I just wanted to show some of the examples here. I don't have the chart to show, but in the case of Mauritius, the islands of Mauritius, wanted to say is that they initiated with Interministerial Coordination Committee that was initially linked to the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development. They had 17 working groups. I think they quickly realized in 2 years that 7 working groups was not a feasible thing for Mauritius. They decided to scale down the working groups, and they constituted 4 working groups. So they now have 4 working groups on economic prosperity, environmental sustainability, social inclusion, governance, and institutional effectiveness. So these working groups basically cover the 17 goals. And now they have a secretariat that manages the technical process, which then supports this higher department that linked to the Prime Minister's office. In the case of Jamaica, which is the most typical case that we see not just in Latin America, but also across the world, it's really a highest level, which is an interministerial, working group or committee, which is then supported by a secretariat that has direct links with different technical ministerial departments, and that can also benefit from the inclusion of civil society. This instrument in Jamaica actually was used for the post-2015 development agenda discussions, and they're still shaping it up and still adapting to have a mechanism that effectively includes civil society. The case of Belize, you see there, it's linked to the Ministry of Economy and Planning. So they have a council, a Sustainable Development Council. Many countries had Sustainable Development Councils that were created after the Agenda 21 in '92. Some countries, these councils on sustainable development fail flat. It was for pushing forward the Agenda 21. In some countries, they were very effective. And some countries are deciding basically to revamp those councils to be able to inform the implementation of the SDGs. In the case of Germany, that I didn't include here, is an example of the effective use of those councils on sustainable development that now is the institutional coordination mechanism for Germany for the SDGs, but actually was created after the 1992 Rio conference. Colombia, it's the more elaborate example of Jamaica, and that's the most typical we see out there. And like I said, with the higher level institution commission supported by a technical secretariat, and then having working groups would be including different segments of society, different segments of stakeholders. You will have cross-sectoral working groups. Costa Rica is very similar to Colombia with the technical secretariat and the high-level council, but I just wanted to mention that they also have a specific unit that links directly with municipalities that have a link with the high-level council and the technical secretariat. Aruba is exactly the same thing as Colombia. It just looks a little bit more complex, but it's not. So it's the cabinet which leads the implementation of the SDG that has the political dimension, supported by SDG Commission that feeds into the Chief of Staff, which is a technical layer. And with several working groups, they have decided on 4 working groups, which has the participation of the non-governmental actors. The last step in the RIA, which is one of the areas integrated into the template, not all these steps are like unique templates, they are integrated. It's basically the understanding of which indicators, when you're reading the plans, the national plan, the sector plan, programs, which indicators have been already, identified, that you can identify in those plans so that you see available or not. This is not a template of a RIA, but it's one of the countries that we worked with the RIA and worked with the maps for Sri Lanka. So it's basically a mapping of the indicators available. We know that we have the tier 1, 2, and 3, the group that is there, being that the indicators that's most ready, available indicators, that data is available from ministries, methodology is agreed. You can use the data with no need for adjustments. The quality is good, is available at subnational level. So we've done the mapping across all the goals to understand what kind of indicators we have nationally, the ones that are most ready, which ones are ready, and the ones that are not ready. And then we look at as well as the indicators that are proposed by the UN statistics indicators. So some of those are the same ones as used by the national indicators, but the national indicators use some indicators which are proxy. So the group 2, which is the indicators that are ready, these are indicators that are feasible. In most cases in Sri Lanka is only available at national level. So the data is not very well integrated with the National Statistics Office, can be scattered across different entities. So there is some challenge there in terms of collecting those data. Methodology exists, it's measurable, accountable, but in some cases needs to be improved, and indicators needs further quality, assurance. In the group 3, which are not ready, is basically the areas where here in this case with 17 national indicators that could be potentially ready, but within the UN proposed SDG framework of indicators, 80 indicators, Sri Lanka is not ready for it. But basically the idea is that the data is not available, the indicators are not feasible. But here what we want to discuss is that it's not to say that the government will need to develop 80 indicators to become ready or, immediately ready, most ready. The idea is really to engage in a discussion to see that some of these indicators might not be applicable to the country context and may not be useful, the investment or to develop capacity in those areas. So each case will need to be looked carefully. With the RIA, what we generate is this template here, which is that when you fill out your template 2, when you are reading, okay, which targets are fully aligned, has indicators, which ones that are partially aligned, that might not have an indicator. So you can construct in Excel, you can construct automatically to have this visualization to understand which areas you have the highest number of indicators that is available. So this is useful, again, to have a discussion, with the government. For instance, it is not a surprise that indicators related to partnership, SDG 17, are often really a huge challenge for all countries that we are working on. Okay, so you see there from the visualization, you see that's precisely what it is. Out of all the indicators needed, we only have about roughly 20%, or a little bit less than 20%. But indicators in this case here related to energy, actually they are readily available and being deployed and being used by the country. Another area when I mentioned, the indicators related to oceans. If you've seen in the formal framework of the UN, you see all of them are group 3, tier 3, which means that they're all methodologies to be accepted globally. And in many cases, in many country cases, you would see this as well, that the availability of indicators for targets related to SDG 14 is very poor for most countries. So I think it just gives you an overview of the country status, and because of the assessment allows you to fill the template and this would be able to be generated, is also another useful piece for the discussion. But in terms of the data and constructing proper monitoring mechanism, certainly UNDP has another approach, which is ecosystem data mapping. And it's an approach that has been rolled out in different countries, and that UNDP is supporting some countries globally to do a proper mapping of the data ecosystem. So I will stop here.
So Renata, before you stop here, there are 3 questions that are in line.
Sure.
I answered them a little bit by writing, but 3 questions that are being posed is, one has to do with the challenge of interinstitutional arrangements for the SDG agenda. The second has to do precisely with what we are addressing now about data, and there is even a final remark here on the relation between the planning exercise and the knowledge that the Institute of Statistics usually have. So challenge of interinstitutionality, data, and they were asking specifically in the case of Sri Lanka, how long did it take, the RIA exercise, and how many people were involved in the process of it? So interinstitution, data, both as challenges, and the specific case of Sri Lanka, how long did it take and who were behind the planning process doing it? Please, if you have any more questions, feel free to write them. I will follow them. So
before addressing those questions, I just wanted to agree with Javier Munoz Blanco. Yes, indeed. Oftentimes, planning documents do not show indicators that are being used by the National Statistics Office or used by line ministries in their sector plans. But remember that when we started the discussion, we were saying that this methodology is a very flexible methodology, it's very intuitive, it's a simple methodology, which allows you, and we do recommend, not just to stay at the National Development Plan, but actually delve into the sector plans. Usually at the level of indicators, the richness comes from sectoral plans. Those sectoral plans will be very specific, and they will be rich in the indicators and specific targets per area that the government would like to achieve. if you do not have time, or some country will have outdated sector plans and only have a national development plan, or has a draft national development plan, by all means you can use this methodology to initiate this discussion. But like we said, is the conclusions you make should never be something cast in stone. The conclusions are areas for further probing, is areas for further discussion with the governments, with the experts. I mentioned before when I also started the discussion, in the case of India, we did it in Haryana, which is at the subnational level, the provincial level. There we've done the analysis of 54 provincial programs. They were not plans, but they were programs of investments. So they also had very specific targets, in some cases very specific indicators, and in a lot of those programs, the budget is very explicit on that. So the methodology is very flexible. It can be applied in any document planning instrument that the government feels is of relevance. Some countries you would go, they may have a national development plan, and then the government may say, don't use this because we are not using it. Nobody's using it. So they are actually very honest to say, don't use it. But they will guide you to indicate what is the best planning instrument that they would recommend to undertake the analysis. How long it takes? It really varies, you know. Like in the case of in the case of Sri Lanka, it's a very simple instrument, very well structured, very easily to read and make the assessments, because they have very clear, you know, analysis is very linear in the sense of every section is exactly the same as the section next. And they have very clear identification of targets, government targets, and in some cases indicators. And in a lot of these cases in annex, the budget associated with it, because it was an investment plan. In other cases, it can be really a nightmare, because it really depends on the shape of the document. In our experience with these 33 countries, is that to do a very solid analysis of a national development plan, it will take 2 weeks full time of one person. I would usually prefer to do one person, because the person will set the criteria and set the standards, and then you have a quality assurance mechanism that involves more people. And that's the reason I was saying I like to do with the footnotes, because every single target I basically go including notes, and I put placeholders if I have any doubt, because that allows me to talk with my technical counterpart. In the case of Sri Lanka was the Ministry of Planning and Finance, and with the UNDP colleagues that were on the ground that obviously had a much better understanding of the country context. Although in the case of Sri Lanka, I had the advantage that I lived in the country for 3 years, but sometimes you don't have that luxury to understand the country context so well. But you really have to rely on the guidance that the colleagues are providing you. And what I recommend is really that when you do the review, that you have people with, it needs to be technical people, but people with the different technical expertise. So in the case of Sri Lanka, I really ask, you know, the experts on gender, I engaged in a conversation with them. And that helped to really understand the other targets beyond gender that were being prioritized, and that way balance that, even though if the government is not prioritizing certain targets under SDG 5 on gender equality, there are other targets that is very much relevant in the context of Sri Lanka to promote gender equality that were being aligned. Sorry, saying prioritize again, but that were aligned, that have been integrated in the plan. So it's very important that, because this is a desk review. So when you do the desk review, you're following a methodology, a process. It is a tool. It's not a magic fix, you know, quick fix tool. It is a tool. It has its limitations. It doesn't solve everything, but it does provide you a good opportunity with questions, areas to probe further, to have an exciting discussion with the government, and then to be able to really understand, okay, if your vision of development is this, most countries have a very long-term strategic vision, right? That would be even 2030 or beyond 2030. So if you start by the strategic vision document and then go to a national development plan, look at a few sector plans if the time allows, That's, I think, the composite that I would suggest. In the Sri Lanka case, we actually continuing because the idea is to do at the provincial level. Each province now has actually just finalizing their plans, and the ones that are not finalizing are in process of having a draft. We will also apply to try to have a conversation with the different districts in Sri Lanka. It's a country that it's heavily decentralized, but have not decentralized their budget. So the budget is really very much at the central level yet, but they are devolving the functions to the provinces and to these districts.
Okay, so we are about to close, but there is a final question. There in a situation where there are indicators of other development partners other than the UN that are in sync with the SDGs, should they be considered as part of the alignment?
Indicators of development partners other than the UN? Well, the alignment here is really not the UN or development partners. Is really what the government is planning. So that's what I said. It either the National Development Plan or sectoral plans or government programs. So we really have not looked at the UN strategy or partners' strategy to apply the RIA. I would say that you could, if DFAID or Spain or JICA has a very large program in a particular country and that has a huge ability to make a difference in accelerating progress in that country, the methodology is flexible. Yes, if Japan has 30 plus countries in a particular country, which happens in some countries in Africa, 30 plus programs, you could get that portfolio and make an assessment to see if the portfolio is really integrated or if the portfolio is overemphasizing some dimensions or not. But at this stage, we only done programs from the government.
And I think that's important, right? I mean, the way we see, and I've seen some cases in our region where this was not really clear. Mm-hmm. And again, we've come a long way from the MDGs. Mm-hmm. The SDGs cannot exist in a schizophrenic world where we have on the one hand national priorities and then we have the SDGs that we report to the international community or whatever. Mm-hmm. The SDGs need to be, and this is part of the entire webinar and the entire training in this case, the SDGs need to be integrated within the national priorities. That's why we are checking the national priorities, right? There is not such a thing like you have your national priorities, your Ministry of Planning, etc., and then you have completely disconnected to everything the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that will come and report here at some point in New York on how they are doing with the SDGs, because it's impossible. The SDGs are completely linked to whatever a country is prioritizing. So the one important idea is the SDGs cannot exist separated from the national planning process and from the national implementation process. Yeah. In this sense, the entire exercise of alignment and checking at the indicators, etc., is precisely to see what is the wealth of indicators that a country has ready or could have ready with additional efforts so that they can report on how the country is progressing, and by doing that, on the 2030 agenda. What Renata is saying is that in some countries, maybe statistical capacities are weak, yet donors may have very big programs that can help feed information on statistics. And we all know that in the Caribbean, statistics are a challenge, and we are working a lot with the statistical institutes to try to go farther in there. But please, think on those terms. Think in terms that actually what a country is able to see for themselves on the progress they are doing is what they will be able to report for the 2030 agenda.
I just wanted to make, don't know if the last point, because I know our time is really running out, but it was an issue that Alejandro mentioned also before on the fact that, yes, there is a strong realization that, and I think initiated with the MDGs, in many countries we did the MDG acceleration framework, the understanding that if you only invest in the sectoral interventions, which were very much aligned with the MDG goals, you would not be able to achieve those goals. So for countries in LAC, Colombia in particular, that have done 75 MDG acceleration framework at the municipal level, I think this was very much clear at government and partners that you need to go beyond the sector. I just came back, a week ago from Mozambique, and Mozambique is a country that any country in Latin America will feel very envious. I can say that Brazil will feel very envious right now because we have negative economic growth right now, going for a second consecutive year. And Mozambique has a 6 to 7% GDP growth for the past 5 to 6 years and is expected to continue in that trajectory in the 3-4 years. That's the forecast from the IMF. But if you look at the trajectory of poverty reduction and social gains in the country basically is stagnated. You go to Maputo province, it's a different, it's a different development situation. You get out of Maputo capital, Maputo province, you feel that you've gone to the pre-industrial revolution era. And I'm not here exaggerating because this actually was told to me by government officials. And it's really based on an economy of subsistence. And what is puzzling there is a country that is so rich and that was a donor darling for many years. In the past 10 years, Mozambique was a donor darling, and now this stardom is started to fade. But I realized from the worry from the government and in conversation with partners there is that partners are not interested to do the same thing that they've done before. And they said we will no longer finance sectoral plans. Now we're interested to understand the interlinkages, what would be the integrated approach, what would make sense, because we've done investments for 10 years and poverty has not reduced. So it was very interesting. I know, Alejandro, you all will be doing the combos, which is a very interesting methodology. But UNDP also works with the countries to support a methodology that's called Foresight, which is basically developing scenarios, and it does have an integrated approach. And we are also started working with another, which is also a Foresight model, which is based on Future Institute model with University of Denver, which is providing a database and that can help us to create profiles for countries very quickly based on data, if data is available, obviously. But I think it's all to say is that I think all this process with the RIA, and then you will be following with the combos, is really a realization that has started with them using, I think, around 2010, and that UNDP does have some merit there in helping and working with countries to understand that we need to go beyond the sector because there are interventions that needs to be, upfront, investments upfront that are non-sectorial as well. So thank you.
So thank you all of you for your active participation, for being there. I hope you enjoyed the webinar as much as I did. It was really a privilege for us to have Renata today. As I said, Gonzalo couldn't join because he was on leave, but we have Gonzalo on the Regional Bureau who works very much with the RIAs, with all the work we are doing on the SDGs, and has worked very closely with Renata over the years. So let me stop here. Let me once again thank Renata, thank the team behind all the work, all the hard work for these trainings and webinars to be active. We will have at the end of this module a question session to clarify any doubts that we have. We are closing now for today. Please, if you have any doubts, anything that you would like to further analyze, let us know through the platform, through the training modules. And there is, of course, the forum to post questions and to participate and engage. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful Tuesday.